You're not tired, you are escaping. And you've learned to call that escape needing rest. Because it sounds reasonable. It sounds justified. But if you look closely at your day, the pattern is obvious. You start something important, and within minutes, your energy drops. Not completely, just enough to make quitting feel acceptable. So you pause. You check your phone. You scroll for a few seconds, which turns into minutes. Then you tell yourself, I'll start again when I feel better. But you don't, because this isn't about energy. It's about resistance. This is where most people lie to themselves. They think they stop because they're exhausted. But the truth is, they stop the moment effort stops feeling easy. There's a difference. Real exhaustion comes after sustained effort. What you're experiencing happens at the beginning. That's not fatigue. That's avoidance. And you've trained yourself to respond to that feeling the same way every time. You feel resistance, you step away. You feel discomfort, you delay. You feel pressure, you reduce the task. And slowly, without noticing, your standard shifts. Not based on what needs to be done, but based on what feels manageable in the moment. And this is the part you keep ignoring. You don't need more energy to move forward. You need to stop obeying the first signal to stop. Because right now, that signal controls everything. What feels like being tired isn't random. It follows a predictable internal pattern. And once you see it, the illusion starts to break. The first mechanism is false fatigue. You interpret early resistance as exhaustion. But real fatigue comes after effort. What you feel in the first 10 to 20 minutes is friction, not depletion. And instead of pushing through it, you label it as a limit. That label gives you permission to stop. This is where most people lie to themselves. Because the feeling is real, but the interpretation is wrong. The second mechanism is the avoidance loop. You feel resistance, you pause, you seek something easy, you feel relief. That relief reinforces the behavior. So next time resistance shows up, your brain already knows the escape route. And now it's automatic, not a decision, a habit. The third mechanism is emotional negotiation. You don't follow your plan, you adjust it based on how you feel. I'll start later. I'll do less today. I'm not in the right state. So your actions are no longer guided by intention. They're controlled by mood. And mood is unstable. Here's a simple real-life pattern. You come home after a long day. You plan to work on something important, maybe a skill, a project, your health. But the moment you sit down, you feel low energy. So instead of starting, you delay. You rest a bit. You scroll. You wait to feel ready. But readiness never comes. Because readiness is not what creates action. Action creates readiness. And this is the part you ignore every day. You're not managing your energy. You are obeying your discomfort. And there's one deeper layer behind this. Something that controls all three patterns at once. Once you see it, the excuse of "I'm tired" stops working completely. The first layer you need to see is this. You don't stop because you're tired. You stop because you've trained yourself to stop early. That training didn't happen once. It happened through repetition. Every time you felt resistance and stepped away, you reinforced the same response. Not consciously, but consistently. This is where most people lie to themselves. They think their limits are physical, but most of their limits are learned. You've conditioned your mind to interpret the first sign of difficulty as a signal to stop, and now it reacts automatically. Here's what that looks like in reality. You start working on something that matters. Within minutes, your focus drops slightly. Not completely, just enough to make the task feel heavier. That's the moment. That's where the decision happens. Most people don't push through. They pause. They shift tasks. They reduce intensity. And in doing that, they confirm the same identity again. I stop when it gets uncomfortable. That identity becomes your default. As Jim Rohn said, success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day. But what most people miss is the reverse. Failure is also a few simple disciplines, like stopping early, repeated daily. And this is the part you ignore every day. You're not struggling with motivation. You are repeating a trained response. A response that says, discomfort means stop. Until that response is interrupted, nothing changes. Because every time you obey it, you make it stronger. And every time you break it, you weaken it. That's the real mechanism. Not energy, not time, conditioning. The second layer is where most people get it completely wrong. They think they need more energy to be consistent. They don't. They need a higher tolerance for discomfort, because what you call low energy is often just low willingness to stay in effort. That's the difference. Energy feels like the problem, but tolerance is the real limiter. This is where most people lie to themselves. They wait to feel ready. They wait for a moment where effort feels natural, smooth, almost effortless. That moment rarely comes. And when it does, it doesn't last. So their consistency becomes dependent on a condition that isn't stable. Here's what actually happens. You begin a task. At first, it's manageable. Then it becomes repetitive. Then slightly frustrating. Then mentally heavy. And this is the exact point where growth begins. Not before, after it stops feeling interesting. But most people exit right there. They don't push into that phase. They avoid it. So they keep restarting the easy part without ever staying long enough to benefit from the hard part. And this is why progress feels slow. Because you're always operating at the surface level of effort, never deep enough for anything to compound. Here's a grounded scenario. Someone wants to improve their fitness. They start working out. First few sessions, high energy, good focus. Then soreness hits. Routine feels repetitive. Now the body isn't the problem. The discomfort is. So they reduce intensity. Skip days. Adjust the plan. Not dramatically, just enough to avoid strain. But over time, that small adjustment becomes the pattern, and results slow down. Not because effort is missing, but because effort never reaches the level where it matters. And this is the part you ignore every day. You don't need more motivation. You need to stay when your mind starts looking for a way out. That's where everything changes. The third layer is quieter, but controls everything. You don't actually trust yourself to follow through when it gets hard. Not fully. And because of that, you subconsciously lower the intensity before you even reach that point. This is where most people lie to themselves. They think they're giving full effort, but they're holding back just enough to stay in control. Because full effort removes excuses. If you go all in and still fall short, you have to face reality. So instead, you operate in a control zone. Not too easy, not too hard, just enough to feel like you're doing something without risking failure. Here's how it shows up. You plan your work. You sit down to execute. But instead of attacking the most important part, you ease into it. You start with smaller tasks. You warm up longer than necessary. You delay the core action. Why? Because once you fully engage, the outcome becomes real. And real outcomes can't be hidden. This is the part you ignore every day. You're not just avoiding effort. You're avoiding clarity about your current level. A grounded example. Someone wants to improve their income. They know they need to make calls, pitch clients, or put their work out there. But instead of doing that, they optimize their setup. Better tools, better plans, better strategies. All useful, but none of it replaces direct action. Because direct action creates feedback, and feedback removes illusion. As Jim Rohn said, you cannot change your destination overnight, but you can change your direction overnight. But changing direction requires a moment of honesty, a moment where you stop preparing and start exposing your actual level through action. And most people delay that moment, because once it happens, there's nothing left to hide behind. The final layer is where everything either stabilizes or keeps collapsing. Because at this point, you're not confused. You're aware. You know when you're avoiding. You recognize the moment you want to stop. You can feel the negotiation happening in real time. And still, you let it happen. This is where most people lie to themselves. They believe awareness should be enough to change behavior. It isn't, because awareness without control just becomes observation. You watch yourself drift and do nothing to interrupt it. That's the gap. And that gap is what keeps your life exactly where it is. Here's how it plays out. You start working. Everything is fine for a while. Then resistance shows up. Not extreme, just enough to break focus. And in that exact moment, your mind offers you an exit. Take a break. Do it later. You've done enough. You recognize it. You even question it, but you still follow it. That's the pattern. Not lack of knowledge, lack of interruption. Because the truth is simple. Your life does not change when you understand the pattern. It changes when you interrupt it consistently. A grounded example. Someone builds a habit of working every evening. At first, it's structured. Then small exceptions appear. One day skipped. One task reduced. Each time, it feels justified. But each time, the standard weakens. And eventually, the routine disappears. Not because they chose to quit, but because they allowed too many interruptions without correction. And this is the part you ignore every day. You don't lose discipline all at once. You lose it in small, repeated permissions. And once those permissions become normal, your behavior adjusts permanently. By now, the pattern isn't hidden anymore. You don't stop because you're tired. You stop because your standard allows you to. That's the structure. And once you see it that way, the problem becomes simpler, but harder to escape. Because now it's not about energy, time, or strategy. It's about what you accept from yourself when effort becomes uncomfortable. This is where everything stabilizes, not through intensity, but through alignment. Discipline is not something you apply occasionally. It's something you reflect consistently, especially when nothing is forcing you to. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They think discipline is effort, something you turn on when needed. But discipline is identity. It's the version of you that doesn't renegotiate once a decision is made. And identity is built in small moments. The moment you feel resistance and choose whether to continue or stop. The moment you feel tired and decide whether that feeling controls you. Those moments look small, but they're structural. Behavior repeated enough becomes identity. Identity reinforced daily becomes outcome. There's no shortcut around that. And this is where responsibility becomes clear. You're already consistent, just not in the direction you claim. You consistently slow down when it gets hard. You consistently adjust your effort based on mood. You consistently exit before the real work begins. That's a pattern, and patterns create predictable results. So the shift is not dramatic. It's precise. You stop treating your feelings as instructions and start treating them as signals to continue. Not once, repeatedly. That's where identity changes. Quietly, permanently. At this point, there's nothing left to figure out. You already know where you stop. You already recognize the moment your effort drops. You already feel the shift when your mind starts offering you an easier option. That's not confusion. That's clarity. And clarity removes excuses. Because now, every time you step away, it's a choice you can see. Not something hidden. Not something accidental. Something repeated. And repetition is what defines you. Not your intentions. Not your plans. What you do when effort becomes uncomfortable. That's the line. And you cross it every day, either by continuing or by stopping. There's no dramatic turning point waiting for you. No sudden surge of energy that fixes everything. Just small moments handled differently, or handled the same. And whichever one you repeat becomes your standard. That standard shapes your behavior. Your behavior shapes your identity. And your identity shapes everything else. So this doesn't come down to motivation. It comes down to whether you keep responding to discomfort the same way, or you finally break that response. Not once, but enough times that it stops being your default. That's where change becomes real. Not loud, not visible at first, but stable. And once it stabilizes, it doesn't need motivation anymore.